Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on COVID comics, What Can Graphic Medicine Teach Us About the Pandemic? Our speaker for this evening is Professor Soha Bayoumi. I'm Gayatri Manu, the Program Associate at Science Gallery, Bengaluru. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Science Gallery, Bengaluru is a public institution for research-based engagement at the interface of the natural and human sciences, engineering, and the arts. This lecture is a part of our ongoing exhibition season, Contagion. And Contagion is our fourth exhibition season and our first fully online exhibition. Contagion explores the phenomena of transmission of diseases, behaviors, and emotions. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me take a moment to share with you our upcoming programs for this weekend. Tomorrow at 5:30 p.m., we have a workshop by Audrey Chang on community-centered pandemic engagement. And at 6:30 p.m., we have a lecture by Mary Augusta Brazelton, who will be speaking about China and global health histories, vaccinating the nation and the world. You can find the registration links to these programs in our chat box. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Soha Bayoumi to all of you, who is a senior lecturer in medicine, science, and the humanities program at the Johns Hopkins University. Trained in political theory, political philosophy, and intellectual history, she works on the question of justice at the intersection of history, political theory, and science, technology, and medicine studies. With a focus on medicine and public health, her research addresses the questions of health and social justice, biomedical ethics, and the medicine-politics nexus, with a geographical focus on the Middle East and a special interest in post-colonial and gender studies. Her research interests focus on medical expertise and how it is deployed in different political contexts. We will have a Q&A session right after this lecture, so do remember to drop your questions in the Q&A box. With that, I'd like to hand over the mic to Soha. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. I really appreciate your generous introduction, and thank you to everyone at Science Gallery Bengaluru. It's really a pleasure to join this really dynamic programming of art and science and medicine all coming together in different contributions from different disciplines, from the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences to think about this current moment that we're all living through. So I'm really delighted to share some of the things that I'm interested in, and particularly graphic medicine, the field of graphic medicine, which I will talk about in a minute, and talk about what graphic medicine can tell us and how it is helping us process the current pandemic and the current global moment that we're all living together. So I will share my screen now. Just a second. So I will, during the slides that I have, given that a lot of the slides that I'm sharing will contain visuals and comics, I will allow the screen to linger sometimes for a minute or two to allow the audience to actually absorb the comic, read the text, and look at the visuals before I proceed with my discussion. So I will start with one comic, and I'll give folks a minute to look at it. So this is a very short comic that was published in the Nib, which is a magazine both published online and in print that it's a comics magazine. And this is a short comic that was included in their pandemic issue, created by Whit Taylor, an American cartoonist and a writer and illustrator. And in it, she was sharing her experience of giving birth in a hospital in the United States during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and the isolation that it imposed on many people, particularly many women giving birth in hospitals who were not allowed to have their loved ones, their partners, etc., join them. Or, usually when we think of, a new child, as she says, a baby, we think of, family and friends and everyone coming together to celebrate that special moment. But of course, with the restrictions of the pandemic, that was not possible. So, this is just an example of, I wanted to start with that to give people a sense of what I'm talking about, COVID comics and what is that? A lot of people, when we think about comics generally, we either think about superheroes or we think about comedy, funnies, the things that are lighthearted and humorous and, talk about, light subjects or science fiction, superheroes, etc. But in general, for the long time and for, perhaps the majority of audiences, comics were associated with a juvenile audience, right? Like children, adolescents, etc. And it was hardly thought that comics can actually be a medium for serious topics, right? Talking about difficult issues and processing difficult and challenging experiences. But as author and academic scholar Hilary Shute, in her book, Why Comics from Underground to Everywhere, tells us comics have long been associated with things that are far away from being humorous or funny or lighthearted, from the idea of disaster and calamity and processing that even in the silver age of comics in the 1950s and 1960s, to comics going underground, particularly in the United States and in North America. In the 60s and 70s with the countercultural movement and the gay liberation movement and the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, etc. A lot of comics were prior to that seen as corrupting the youth and went underground. People were publishing comics underground and in zines and the things that they were printing out themselves and public and handing out. And of course, that was before the internet. And until later, comics were also, we saw how comics can be dealing with very difficult subjects. Perhaps the most famous example is Art Spiegelman's award-winning book, Mouse, which was about his father's, it was the first graphic novel or graphic memoir or comic book to win the Pulitzer Prize. And in it, he was processing his father's experience or talking about narrating his father's experience as a Holocaust survivor. So comics do have a lot of history in terms of dealing with difficult subjects, actually, and unlike the common understanding of comics as really associated with levity and humor. And it's not to say that you cannot weave humor into the discussion of difficult subjects or even tragic subjects, but it's to say that comics is a medium, just like any other medium, like film, like painting, like and a medium, it can be used to all sorts of ends, to all sorts of purposes. And so it can be used to talk about funny things and, create humor, but it can also be used as a form of art to talk about difficult experiences and difficult subjects. Enter in the mid-2000s, the first decade of the current century, the field of graphic medicine. So what is graphic medicine? Graphic medicine as a term was coined in 2007 by cartoonist and physician, general practitioner Ian Williams, who at the time was, writing a master's thesis in the medical humanities, and as a cartoonist, as a physician and cartoonist, combining his interests in both fields, sort of try to explore what comics can do in narrating the healthcare stories that he encounters and that others encounter as well. And so he defined graphic medicine as the intersection between the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare, which is sort of like an intentionally broad enough definition, right, to incorporate all sorts of stories, of narratives, of formats, etc., that are all encompassed within this field of graphic medicine. So, why comics? What do they do? What are they offering us? Perhaps one of the important things that comics offer us, according to many commentators, is the notion of abstraction. Unlike a lot of, other art, mediums, if you will, comics is really based on simplifying the universe. According to cartoonist and writer Brian Fees, author of a famous book in the graphic medicine, a graphic medicine classic by now, Mom's Cancer, published in 2004, I believe, one of the earlier books in the genre. Comics is about taking out elements, right? You are trying to simplify the reality that you're living or the story that you're telling into its basic elements in a way that becomes more relatable to others. Scott McCloud, also a cartoonist and author of Understanding Comics, talks a lot about the concept of abstraction and its centrality to comics that allows for more and more people to relate to the story. The abstraction of comics allows people to really just see through the humanity of people who are being depicted and whose stories are being told, as opposed to getting hung up necessarily on what sets them apart, thinking about the commonality, thinking about, oh, this could be me because of how things are simplified. Some comics can be as simple as drawing stick figures, and faces with, very minimal, lines and strokes, just to express an emotion, but not really showing particular features or skin color or what have you. And so this abstraction sort of allows for, more universality in sort of sending out the message or the story that is being told. In many ways, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Visuality is absolutely important in our culture, and we do, particularly in this current age of, internet memes and things like that, where really, an image can capture a lot of things. An image can be, really worth. And a whole essay, like a 20-page essay, can be captured in one image. Pictures and play a very important part in telling stories and sharing experiences. a lot of people can, particularly people who do not have time to read a lot, or are not particularly proficient readers, etc. Or also, this is something that has been documented, people with reading difficulties, who have some learning disabilities like dyslexia, for instance, etc., have found comics to be a particularly compelling medium that allows them to get engaged and to be able to both consume and produce narratives in ways that are more accessible to them. Comics allow a lot of people to control their own narrative, tell their own story in ways that may be accessible to them and to others. And this is connected to the notion of what is called visual pathographies, the concept of visual pathographies. Visual pathographies are, the notion of pathography basically is the telling of the story about a disease and its impact on an individual or a community. And visual pathographies, so this can take, pathography can of course take the form of a memoir, for example. Visual pathographies are those narratives told in comic format, usually in a visual or graphic format. And so visual pathographies definitely represent a very important segment of the graphic medicine field. Another important thing is the sort of how comics is adding variety to the ways that we are chronicling and documenting this current moment. There are actually many attempts to create people's archives, if you will, of this current moment, right? Both sound archives, people telling their stories through sound, recording themselves, people sharing diaries, people, there are all sorts of online archives that are trying to democratize the process of record keeping, if you will, for future historians, hopefully, who might want to tell the story of this current pandemic and its impact on so many lives. And comics, people are writing stories, they are recording themselves, they are dancing, filming themselves, doing all sorts of things. And people are also drawing, and many are drawing comics to tell their stories. And it's another way of diversifying and democratizing how people are telling their stories and which stories get to be told and archived and preserved and sort of considered to be valuable in documenting this current moment. And this is, I'm borrowing this from physician and cartoonist Mike Natter, who talked about how comics can play both a didactic and a cathartic function. Some comics can be purely didactic, and we'll see examples of those in some of the next few slides. They are educational comics. They want to tell people what to do, what not to do, explain some concepts to people, particularly in the current flood of information and misinformation, etc. But some other comics are meant to be purely cathartic. They are meant to be a way for the comics creators to process the very difficult experiences they encountered, either as patients themselves or as caregivers for loved ones who were sick, or as healthcare providers who were experiencing a lot of stress and workload and emotional turmoil as a result of the tragedy unfolding in front of them, and how they are being called to act, and also how they themselves may be anxious or isolated from their families, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of comics combine both functions. They are cathartic in a way, but they also have a message to convey. They have an educational message, if you will. A lot of, when we ask like, okay, what's the scope of this? Is this such a niche thing? And actually, I myself was pretty surprised and continue to be pretty surprised by the sheer volume of comics being produced in all sorts of formats, published online, zines, etc., that are being distributed about COVID and how many people. Some people are professional cartoonists. Some people are completely amateurs. This might be their first time, drawing a comic, and really choosing that format to sort of depict their story or to tell their narrative. So these are some compilations of chronicles. There are two of them two of these books are called COVID Chronicles. And one of them, COVID Chronicles, a comics anthology, was published by Penn State University Press, which publishes a lot of graphic medicine titles, and there's the other COVID Chronicles by journalist Ethan Sachs and cartoonist Dalibor Talajic, who sort of collaborated to tell the stories of 10 different individuals, healthcare providers, patients, etc., and their experiences with COVID from different parts around the world. And Corona Pandemic Comics is another compilation of cartoons. There are two magazines that were dedicated to comics. I already mentioned the Nib magazine, the pandemic issue. They had a special issue on the pandemic, which was entirely comics dedicated to talking about COVID. The Lockdown Lowdown, which they published 4 different, I believe 3 or 4 different issues on COVID. The latest is on women and the gender aspects of COVID, the COVID pandemic. And there are also some books that are more lighthearted, sort of talking about like coping and humor, etc., during the pandemic. Rachel Smith's book came out. It was originally published on her website as webcomics, and which were finally compiled in this format to be published as quarantine comics, sort of talking about her life during lockdown. So a lot of these, what are they doing? In the next few slides, I will just try to very briefly show some examples of what these comics are trying to do, what their functions are, what they can be teaching us, how they can be contributing to our understanding of the pandemic. And of course, one of them, roles of comics, or one of the functions that we saw is how it was, chronicling real stories of real people, and their difficult experiences with COVID. This is from Ethan Sachs and Dalibor Talajic's COVID Chronicles, and here talks about this woman who had COVID and was ultimately hospitalized, etc., and the isolation and the fact that all of the symptoms, like talking about all of the difficult symptoms when they decided that she needed to go to the hospital, and the difficulties of taking care of, not being able to take care of her children, and the complications of having her fiance visit her to take care of her, and all of those issues. This is also another example from the same book, a different story about healthcare workers. And perhaps one of the great thing about comics, what things that the comics were able to show us, is they were really a great way of depicting clinical spaces that are often unseen. A lot of comics that were either written by healthcare workers or in collaboration with healthcare workers, are depicting scenes from emergency rooms and intensive care units, et cetera, and sort of like talking about the toll that COVID has taken on healthcare workers. And those are spaces that are not usually depicted, right, because of privacy concerns and efficiency and productivity concerns and things like that. And comics is a way, sort of a window for a larger audience to sort of take a look at actually what happens in hospital wards, in ERs and ICUs, et cetera. Comics were even used on the cover of the New Yorker magazine. Chris Ware, the famous cartoonist, created 2 covers for the New Yorker that were sort of depicting some scenes from the pandemic. This one is probably my favorite, and it was from early on in the pandemic in April 2020, and in it we see a healthcare worker who is working in the hospital, wearing PPE, talking to their partner and their children on FaceTime or on the phone, and video chatting with them, because a lot of healthcare workers could not go home. It could not be with their children, could not be with their families, etc. And so that this was really a very real way of depicting that aspect of the pandemic. Here's another way of also talking about healthcare workers, and particularly the absence of families and loved ones in the hospitals. Like perhaps one of the most heartbreaking aspects of a contagious epidemic is that the contagious nature of the epidemic means that families and loved ones cannot be in the hospital, cannot take care of the sick ones, and so it's entirely the care of strangers. And many people unfortunately end up on ventilators and ICUs, etc. They can't even talk for themselves for the most part, and so this is also from COVID Chronicles, this one is from NPR, and by Ryan Kellman and Kristen Ratke, and it's called On Dying Alone, and how behind every COVID-19 case there is a story, and how this healthcare worker was constantly talking to families on the phone and loved ones about their sick loved one, and just trying to get a sense of who that person was and how to take care of them, etc. How that person was before they were sick. This is also another example of that. A lot of comics about that were written by healthcare providers about about COVID were lamenting the fact that the isolation of patients, that patients did not have families or loved ones with them, was really a complicating factor for the delivery of care. So this one is talking really about the absence, trying to depict in a very visceral way the absence of family members. It says, "I long for the day when our hospital families can return and fill the void at the side of the bed." And also, this is from the same comic by Nathan Gray, says depicting this patient who was saying, "I don't think I want more treatments if it means I am stuck here without my family." So, again, it shows how this isolation was a really complicating factor for the delivery of care and the kind of care and the choices that people were making around their treatment during COVID. This is, again, one way of really penetrating the very private lives of people. This is from the COVID Chronicles. This is from Wuhan, story, excuse me. A story from Wuhan, and how in the early days of the pandemic, when Wuhan was under lockdown, people would go to their windows and or their balconies and start shouting out slogans, to sort of like galvanize the city and boost morale and things like that. We saw similar things in Italy and Spain and other parts around the world where people were going out their windows and balconies and singing and trying to find some sort of collective, experience in this very isolating moment. So this was sort of depicting the public facing nature of that, but there are also some that were depicting some comics that were depicting very intimate moments. This is an example from Colleen Venable and Ellen Crenshaw's The New Normal, which was published in the Nibs pandemic issue, in which it was depicting this person's actually chronicling their COVID illness and all of the symptoms. I was achy and feverish and constantly on the verge of calling an ambulance, terrified of what it might cost, because obviously, in the United States, there's no universal healthcare coverage, and calling an ambulance, even if you have healthcare insurance, can cost you money. And sometimes it can cost a lot of money and can be unpredictable, et cetera, and can be a real barrier for people accessing care. And so, she says, I often woke up drenched in under boob sweat that created an exact image of Deadpool's face. Between being unable to crawl into the shower and fostering a litter of baby rabbits, losing my sense of smell was probably a blessing. So you see both the suffering and the comedy, and how they combine to sort of really depict a more realistic version of how this person was feeling and experiencing their illness. Also, New Yorker cartoonist Jason Chatfield got COVID and sort of depicted his experience with the pandemic, with the illness, his symptoms and all of that in comic format. This is from the India-based website, the Quint. Iram Gur and talks about how COVID stole her sense of smell and taste, and and how it was. She says how every day felt like a roller coaster ride, where like each turn brought along new symptoms. Social relations were also really impacted by COVID, and comics found a way to also talk about that. This is from Max Low's Love in the Time of Corona, also published in the Nib pandemic issue. And in it, he talks about how he lived and worked in Malaysia while his partner recently married. They had just gotten married a month before the pandemic started, was living in Singapore, where she was studying, and they would go and visit each other because there was this like big bridge that connected the two countries. But then when COVID hit, the closure of the bridge meant that they could not see each other for months on end, and sort of talking about what that isolation meant for them and being forced to be in a long distance relationship and all of that. Mental health during the pandemic was also something that we, sort of like a theme that came up a lot in a lot of comics. This is actually drawn by Ian Williams, the founder of the field of graphic medicine and the website graphicmedicine.org. He works as a physician, as a general practitioner. And here he's like talking to a patient and he's saying like, yeah, we have to do a lot of, these are unsettling times. We have to do a lot of things over the phone as much as possible, seeing patients and stuff over the phone or on video calls. And so how's it going, Sandy? And so Sandy's like, my anxiety has been terrible, obviously, but the suicidal thoughts seem to have settled. I mean, this might sound a bit selfish, but now that life is shit for everyone, not just for me, I'm actually feeling a bit better. And so he's like, great. So of course you see like, it's both sad and funny at the same time, but also very much relatable to a lot of people. The anxiety of the pandemic, again, I mentioned mental health, just people doing mundane things or things that they would normally do in normal life, that like go to the grocery store became a whole adventure, and a lot of people became very anxious about it, particularly people with anxiety disorders and other mental health issues, and you must go to the grocery store, but then you can be paralyzed, or suffer panic attacks or anxiety attacks during and after and things like that. So that was definitely a theme that came up a lot. There was also some comedic levity about how people were coping with isolation and quarantine. This is from Rachel Smith's quarantine comics, and a lot of people commented on that, how everyone at the beginning of the quarantine lockdown, etc., was like, oh, I'm going to use this time to be super productive and do this and that and learn 10 languages and exercise and, learn knitting, whatever. And then like also me, I'm just like, I'm going to be watching Netflix or eating, junk food or whatever. And this is also from Russ, the great Russ Chast, very famous New Yorker cartoonist, depicting her experience living in New York City, which became almost like a ghost city with the pandemic, was one of the cities that were hardest hit in the United States at the beginning of the pandemic. Again, with comedic levity. This is another example from Gemma Carell's. Gemma Carell is a cartoonist who publishes in the Nib and in other venues, and here she's also talking about like expectations versus reality. Like, this is what I will do, oh, finally I'll read all these great novels, but what I'm actually doing, just like obsessively checking my phone and checking the news. I will learn to bake, but I'm actually just stress eating junk food. I will work on this craft project. No, I'm just gonna be on Pinterest and pinning images of like weird 1970s novelty cakes, or all of those things. So there were also educational comics, as I mentioned. There were some comics. This was published in the Nib. It was about explaining the new strains of COVID-19 and what virus mutations mean, and how they happen and things like that. And so they were used to sort of like simplify some of the science behind and provide a visual way for people to consume the science behind viral mutations and how new strains are created, and what that might mean for the course of the pandemic. They were also used. This was published by the National University of Singapore, the medical school of the National University of Singapore, who published actually a lot of comics, a lot of educational comics about COVID. And here they're talking about the vaccines and whether pregnant women should get the shot. And here, like, this woman's mother-in-law is like, no, you should not get the vaccine. You can wait. We don't know how it will affect pregnant women. And she's like, actually, like, explaining the science behind why it is important for pregnant women to actually get vaccinated, and how actually the antibodies can even pass on to the fetus, to the baby, etc. So sort of like explaining some of them. The science in a simple way. Also, there were things that were about very basic things like how to use a playground during a pandemic. A lot of kids were suffering from isolation, like, we can't go to school, can't go to the playground, can't do this, can't do that. So, how to use a playground in a pandemic. There are obviously risks, but you can try to mitigate the risks by doing these things, and now we know that the virus does not spread as much from surfaces as we initially thought. Things, again, as simple as hand washing. This is by well-known cartoonist Ellen Forney, and here this was published in the Washington Post. Just something like using funny metaphors to talk about how people can wash or should wash their hands, right, in the appropriate way. Also, comics were used to debunk myths, particularly because of all the misinformation that was spreading around COVID and around, vaccines and around treatments and things like that, facilitated by particular governments as well, that, like in the United States, the Trump administration, in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro's administration, government in India. You all are familiar with how misinformation was sort of facilitated by a lot of governments and regimes. And in that misinformation, a lot of people were trying to use accessible tools to debunk myths. Children were also an audience for some of the comics that were produced. Malaika Harib produced a number of comics for NPR that were aimed at kids, and actually many of them ended up being distributed by schools and libraries and things like that for children. This was in February of 2020, at the very, very, very early stages of the pandemic, before it was even announced, declared by the WHO as a global pandemic. It was trying to explain to the kids what coronavirus is, when people were still hearing about COVID and coronavirus and things like that, and people were starting to get scared. Particularly children were starting to get worried and anxious. It was trying to explain the simple facts to children. This one was trying to sort of like address the behavioral issues that children were starting to struggle with, and the isolation of the pandemic and things like that, after months of lockdown and and the loss of sense of normality. Comics were also used to, and I will, conclude in 2 minutes, were used to provide a lot of political and social commentary. Here in the United States and in many parts around the world, really the COVID pandemic showed a lot of the things that were broken, like really broken in society. All the inequalities, were even exacerbated by the pandemic or made obvious by the pandemic. How different communities were sort of like scapegoated, or were deprioritized, or were even sometimes demonized, right, as either responsible for the spread of the pandemic, or as not responsible enough, or for in terms of personal responsibility in their behaviors and things like that. So this was a comic that was published in the Nib by Victoria Marcelino, who is a Latina woman, and was talking about the sense of the sense of isolation and how it was impacting different families differently. For a lot of white families in the United States and in many parts of the world, family is usually understood as the nuclear family, whereas for people of the global majority, as I like to say, families go beyond this notion of the nuclear family. Extended families are definitely family, and sort of the connections and the kinship that exist, the relations of kinship that exist among extended families are so strong that the pandemic was extremely disruptive to a lot of these familial relations. So this was also a way for people of minoritized backgrounds and communities, et cetera, to talk about their experiences with COVID and the social experiences beyond just like the physical issues. This was a comic, also another comic that was published in the Nib about how the pandemic was exacerbating the homelessness crisis in the United States. And so it was talking about this community of people without shelter, without homes, stable homes, and how they were really impacted by the pandemic in ways that were not particularly visible to the larger society. I mentioned Jair Bolsonaro. This was a comic produced about Brazil, and sort of like how it's called How to Mishandle a Pandemic. As you all know, Jair Bolsonaro is potentially facing charges for the ways he decided to handle the pandemic. Also, anti-Asian racism was rampant in the United States and in Europe. Seeing Asian people, particularly Chinese people, as responsible for the start and the spread of the pandemic, et cetera. So a lot of Asian artists were talking about these experiences, right, and how they were experiencing different form of anti-Asian hate and racism. A lot of comics were trying to some comics were trying to put things in historical perspective and provide context for this epidemic by showing how other epidemics in the past affected people. And perhaps a 2019 book actually called Fever Year, it was a comic book published in 2019 right before the pandemic started, was about the fever year of the flu pandemic of 1918. And it became very popular for a lot of people, looking at the parallels between the current pandemic and the previous iterations. I focused here on English language comics, but really you will find a lot of comics produced in so many languages about COVID. This is a Spanish cartoon by Spanish cartoonist and physician Monica Lalanda, talking about the symptoms of COVID, etc. And let me end with this slide. In the Graphic Medicine Manifesto, which was published a few years ago, also by Penn State University Press and co-authored by Ian Williams and other founders of the graphic medicine field. Graphic medicine, they say, is also a movement for change that challenges the dominant methods of scholarship in healthcare, offering a more inclusive perspective of medicine, illness, disability, caregiving, and being cared for. And I hope that through this slideshow, I was able to show some of the ways that graphic medicine and comics were doing that in regards to the particularly exceptional moment, even though it's no longer exceptional, it's become our new normal of the pandemic and of COVID-19. So thank you all very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Soha, for that wonderful lecture and for showing all of us the power that drawings have in capturing an event that would be otherwise so difficult to describe. I'll move on to some of the questions that have come in from the audience. We have an anonymous attendee who asks, I'm wondering what role humor plays in graphic medicine, given that the topics covered can be serious and they deal with illness and loss. How do people respond to humor that is part of some of these comics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, as I mentioned earlier, like comics don't have to be humorous, but oftentimes we we find that even comics that are dealing with a lot of tragic subjects are also incorporating humor, and it can take a variety of forms. It can be like Black comedy, it can be like gallows humor, like, like I'm dealing with this very difficult thing, but look, I can still see the humor in it, in retrospect. Or it's like sometimes like whistling through the graveyard, it's a way of distracting yourself from the very difficult and tragic situation that you're in. And I think a lot of people find that humanizing, like, yes, we're dealing with difficult subjects, but it doesn't have to be like, we, all of us sometimes deal with, resort to humor as a way of coping with difficult issues and difficult moments in our lives, to try to learn to not take ourselves too seriously, or and so, humor definitely plays a significant role, but it differs, from one writer creator to another. There's a lot of variety. There are people who are particularly funny and humorous by nature, and just like this is part of their personality, and that's what they see even in the darkest moments. And there are others for whom humor does not, come up as much, or is not as, naturally part of how they perceive the world. And so it really differs. Just as as you see different styles in writing, there are some people who write about difficult subjects and include humor, and others who don't. But there is something about comics that makes even the most difficult subjects more accessible to people. There's something about sort of like how we associate, culturally, even in the back of our minds, associate comics with more lighthearted topics that allow us to, it can be engrossed in a comic that talks about cancer, or, Alzheimer's, or really difficult experiences, in ways that, if I saw a book about Alzheimer's, just like words, text, I'd be like, it's too, I don't want to read it, it's too heavy. But if it's like in comic format, it's like, oh yeah, maybe I can read that. So a lot of people find that aspect also sort of welcoming, or makes comics more accessible to people who might be interested in reading about difficult subjects but find that hard.
Indeed, Soha, and I think your presentation and the panels that you chose to show us in this lecture are reflective of that there can be many different approaches to dealing with a moment like this. So we have another question from Abhishek, who asks, how does one measure the effect comics have in getting important messages across during the pandemic? Are there parameters to assess the success of graphic medicine?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So it's still too soon, to be honest, to think about the impact of comics during the COVID pandemic specifically. I'm sure there are people who are working on that as we speak, but I don't think I've seen like studies about that. But there are studies that in the past have tried to examine or assess the impact of comics in graphic medicine in a variety of formats, from thinking about patient care and the clinical encounter, and how some patients, when they were shown drawings and things that are explaining their conditions to them, right, by doctors or other healthcare providers, actually had better outcomes in terms of sticking to their treatment plan, et cetera, to their treatment regimen, even using like pictorial elements in drug inserts, has shown to be effective in people really following the instructions of their drugs in terms of the medications that they are taking, in terms of like what to avoid, whether they should avoid like alcohol, or when they should take it with a meal or before a meal or whatever. And also there's quite a bit of work that has study scholarship that was trying to look at how comics were helping medical students and healthcare providers in sort of thinking about their levels of empathy with patients, because when patients are depicting their experiences with the illness, right, it allows doctors a window into sort of seeing this patient that they're dealing with as a full human being, as opposed to just a case, right, and a set of symptoms, right? So there's quite a bit of that, also quite a bit of studies that are showing, the impact of comics on building empathy and increasing empathy among medical students and healthcare providers. I could go on and on. There are quite a bit of studies that were trying to assess the impact, and it's mostly been positive impact. But it's also important to note that comics are a medium, just like any other medium, right? It's a medium that has unique possibilities and provides unique opportunities, but it can also, the quality of what is produced depends on who is producing it and their level of knowledge and skill and ability, etc. Because comics can also be used to to spread misinformation. That's also possible, right? So it's really about what is, who's creating that and in what context and to what end, etc. So it's important to think of it as, as a tool among many other tools.
Thank you, Soha. We have a comment from one of the attendees, and I wonder if you'd like to respond to it. They say, during the pandemic, I came across artists making Patachitra paintings. For our non-Indian audiences out there, it's a cloth scroll type painting that is made in the states of West Bengal and Odisha, sharing the collective experience of the pandemic and precautions that they should keep in mind. I found them particularly interesting because they were based on what the artists saw on TV and heard on radio. The paintings were then shared with the songs. Just wanted to share this.
Yeah, I actually think I saw the paintings that you're referring to. I think I came across some of them. That's really interesting. Yeah.
So I also wonder, given that you're a historian of medicine, do we have any early examples of graphic medicine being produced and deployed in past pandemics as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So comics were used, we have, evidence of comics being used in the 19th century for all sorts of purposes, but comics were sort of differently understood and differently consumed at the time. There were a lot of, in the 19th century, we started seeing some of the first publications that were publishing cartoons with political and social commentary. So there were definitely some quite a bit of comics that were talking about healthcare and doctors and going to the doctor and incorporating humor and things like that to talk about that. We did see a lot of not necessarily comics in the sense that it's like panels, sequential art, etc., but more like drawings that during previous pandemics, particularly during the 1918 influenza pandemic, where they were basically giving people instructions on like what to do and what not to do, and wearing a mask and things like that. And then later on, comics. Later on in the 20th century, we started seeing comics being used to send certain political messages. Like even here in the United States, for example, the American Medical Association used cartoonist Will Eisner to, who's a famous cartoonist. There's an award named after him, a comics award named after him, to produce comics that were sort of dissuading people from so-called socialized medicine, like we don't want to have universal health care because, we don't want the government to be, sort of like between the patient and the doctor. And so, the American Medical Association had for a long time, like a very conservative view of so-called socialized medicine. They coined the term socialized medicine. We're sort of like depicting it as this bogeyman, you know, like scary socialized medicine. We don't want to be communists, blah, blah, blah. So they were used to, you know, for various things, but we don't have evidence of comics being used in this really widespread way by, you know, normal people sort of documenting their experiences or telling their stories in this way. And I think the internet has definitely helped a lot in allowing for people to share their experiences, because a lot of people can also create comics using digital art. And you know, and just it costs nothing, and you can put it on the internet, share it on your Instagram, or, you know, whatever.
It's fascinating you say this, Soha, especially about the intent behind creating these comics, because we have an exhibit that we're showing as a part of Contagion called Drawing the Bombay Plague, where the artist has made this interactive artwork, and it's a 6 by 10 foot piece, but it's interspersed with these comics that were made by people who ran the Hindi Punch, which was a periodical. And they produced these comics during the third plague pandemic, which was in 1896. And more often than not, you can find that these drawings were critiquing the approach that the colonial authorities took in order to contain the plague. And it wasn't, as you said, meant to be prescriptive or cathartic, but more in that sense of this is what the population here is subjected to, and this is how we want to respond to it in a sort of cheeky but yet politically relevant manner. So thank you so much, Soha, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
I would like to remind everyone who's present here to please fill out the feedback form that we're sharing in the chat. We'd love to know what worked well for you in this lecture and what we could do better going forward. So we'd love to hear from you. And for those of you who want to share this lecture with your colleagues and friends, you can find the recording of this lecture on our YouTube channel, along with all the other lectures that have been conducted as a part of our public lecture series. And if you enjoyed this program, we have a workshop coming up titled Connecting Culture, Community, and Science Through Visual Storytelling by Samir Honwad, Anthony White, and Shakuntala Gopal. In this workshop, you will get to create graphic novels along with peers from across the world. So if this lecture has compelled you to dive deep into the world of graphic medicine and even try it out for yourself, so I would invite you to attend the workshop. And also do read The Virus, which is an ethnographic comic book on the experiences of people who live with hepatitis C. The book is present in our reading room, and it's a part of our exhibition season, Contagion. Before we close, I'd like to thank the NCBS team who has supported this event. And thank you all so much for coming. Do have a good night, and we hope to see you at our future events. Bye-bye.